The tide is turning. This is now a wide receiver dominant fantasy world that we live in today. I'm going to break down the top 10 for you as of today in my rankings for absolutely free. So if you enjoy, drop a like, subscribe to the channel. We do everything fantasy twice a week. Kicking off here with some honorable mentions. And these are not honorable mentions. These are just guys 11 through 20. If you want to hear the deep dive on these guys, just go back on the channel. It's in the recent videos where we dive deeper into these guys' and situations and why they can be successful in 2024. So those are 11 through 20. Again, a lot of those guys can be interchangeable as far as which spot that they are in. And the same can be said for 10 through 6 and then 5 through 1. A lot of these guys are interchangeable. But at number 10, I do have Brandon Aiyuk. He was the wide receiver 14 last season, and he was just very steady throughout the entire year. And I say steady because out of the 17 games he did play in, 10 of those games, he had 15 plus fantasy points. So, again, we knew what we were getting on a weekly basis from Brandon Aiyuk, but he's coming back to the same exact situation as last year. But if I'm being honest, we're all still waiting on that elite breakout level wide receiver one fantasy year from a guy like Brandon Aiyuk. Again, he was a borderline wide receiver one last year. We want to see this guy in the top 8, and that's honestly what we're waiting for. But again, great situation. He should be the lead wide receiver yet again here in 2024. At number 9, we have Michael Pittman, the wide receiver 13 last year, one spot ahead of Brandon Aiyuk, and that came with career highs across the board. Not to mention, he did it not with Anthony Richardson, but for Gardner Minshew for the majority of the season. But Anthony Richardson should be back in fully healthy to start the year for Michael Pittman. And throughout their first 3 weeks that they played together last year before Richardson went down with an injury, Michael Pittman was the wide receiver 8 throughout the first month or so of the season, averaging just about 18 fantasy points a game. This offseason, Michael Pittman got paid for how good he made Gardner Minshew look. His quarterback is back, and there's a lot of help around him as far as the wide receiver room to give this guy, again, a lot of one-on-one matchups, and that is where Michael Pittman strives. I love the PPR upside of Michael Pittman this year. We just need Anthony Richardson to stay healthy, but I love this guy in, let's say, the 3rd round. At number 8, we have Puka Nacua. We talked about Cooper Kupp. You guys know I'm high on Cooper Kupp, this year as long as he can stay healthy. But for Puka, at this time last year, Puka was widely unknown to the general media. But Cooper Kupp going down with an early season injury, it opened up a lot of opportunity, and it opened the door for one of these young wide receivers to step up. Puka answered the call, and he finished the year as the wide receiver 4. That included 8 games with at least 20 fantasy points. Absolutely insane production. I don't know if we've ever had a better rookie fantasy receiving season, at least not probably since back like Randy Moss in those days, right? But Puka's coming back to the same exact situation as last year, but now he has more trust behind him from Matt Stafford, his quarterback, and of course the coaching staff in a guy like Sean McVay. Sure, again, I'm high on Cooper Kupp. We do have to worry about him potentially returning to form, but I just can't see Cooper Kupp returning to form to what he was in the Triple Crown year. He's not going to be Triple Crown Cooper Kupp anymore, especially now with the emergence of a guy like Puka Nacua. Again, Puka might have the higher upside than Cooper Kupp, which I believe he does, and that's why he's slightly higher in my rankings. But some of these guys are so interchangeable. When we get to draft day, who knows? I might have them neck and neck in my rankings, but both wide receivers are going to be dominant. I think Puka just has the slightly higher upside, and that's why he's at number 8. At number 7, A.J. Brown. This time last year, I started to rave about this guy on a weekly basis, and I was telling you guys he's going to be a top 5 wide receiver. There were some questions, but ultimately he did finish as a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. He and his counterpart in DeVonta Smith got paid this offseason, so shout out to them and their families. But this team is ready to get back to winning. Last year, let's not forget, they started 11-0 or 10-0, and they were just taking over everybody. They were dominating. And this year, they're looking to get back to how dominant they were in that year and a half stretch. Now, I don't have the same wide receiver number 1 hype around A.J. Brown this year than I did last year, because eventually DeVonta Smith is going to have to take that next step, right, and take over in this offense, even though both guys are in the prime of their career. But A.J. Brown is still the clear-cut number 1 wide receiver. He's a top 10 wide receiver in real life and in fantasy football. And he's a guy, again, in the physical prime of his career, and he has a great situation to top all of it off. To put it clearly, I would, in the one mock draft I've done this year already for the channel, I drafted this guy in the 1st round. So it still tells you I'm really high on A.J. Brown and his upside this year, but I just don't think he has the potential like last year to finish as the overall wide receiver one. Still great, still a top 10 wide receiver. At number 6, it is Garrett Wilson. We have to throw last year out of the window when we think about Garrett Wilson because it never really got started, at least not what we were expecting from Garrett Wilson. If Aaron Rodgers can stay healthy this year, I still believe that Garrett Wilson has the potential, more so than A.J. Brown and the guys below him, to finish as the wide receiver one on the season. But again, we need that old man to stay healthy throughout the entirety of it. But he's the go-to guy in an offense that has a Hall of Fame first ballot level quarterback in Aaron Rodgers. And this is a team that ultimately is ready to win right now. And not to mention the wide receiver two in this offense, Mike Williams, of course, offseason acquisition. He doesn't have a great track history of health either. So if anything happens to Mike Williams throughout the year, which again, he doesn't really play more than 8 games, Garrett Wilson's only going to get more targets and more opportunities in this offense to dominate throughout stretches of the season and single-handedly win you your fantasy weeks. So again, he has a ton of upside. I would definitely contemplate a late first-round selection with a guy like Garrett Wilson. But if you want to be safe, again, because of how much he burned us last year, maybe you grab him here in the early to mid-second round. But I think definitely he's worth that early round selection. Moving into the top 5, it is my favorite wide receiver in the league, a.k.a. the Sun God. Amon-Ra St. Brown was the wide receiver 3 last season, and that includes missing a game and another game where he only had 5 fantasy points. Remember, he left the game with an injury, but other than that, he had 10 games with 20-plus fantasy points. 10 of them, 10 games with at least 20 points, and 3 of those were 30-plus point outings. It's such a consistent and great player. He gives us that rare combination of elite floor and elite ceiling, and that's why I love Amon-Ra St. Brown. But same situation as last year. Amon-Ra is only going to get better. The chemistry is only going to be greater between him and Jared Goff. And Amon-Ra is going to be the force behind an offense that's looking to get back to the promised land and hopefully this time get over the top. But for the regular season and for us fantasy players, Amon-Ra is going to be a top 5 wide receiver, and I'd be more than happy to have him as my number 1 on my team. Justin Jefferson, it seems criminal to have him this low. And again, this low as in the 4th wide receiver on my board. But last year, we were sitting here and saying it was him or Christian McCaffrey as the consensus number 1 overall pick. Most people went Justin Jefferson. And if you did, I really feel bad for how the second half of your season turned out if you didn't move off of him. But this is a guy that dealt with a lot of injuries last year. And even with those injuries, when we take that into account, he still had 24-plus fantasy point games, right? In 7 of the 10 games he did play. So in 7 games last year, he had over 24 fantasy points, whether if that was Kirk Cousins or late in the season with Josh Dobbs as his quarterback. The only reason he's this low is because of that quarterback situation, whether if it's Sam Darnold or rookie J.J. McCarthy if he gets in the mix. Do we want to trust them to produce a fantasy, an elite fantasy option, a top 3 level fantasy wide receiver? I don't know if I trust him more so than the quarterbacks of the receivers that are above Justin Jefferson. Again, he's such a talented player, arguably the best receiver in the league. And if Kirk Cousins was still in town, Jefferson wouldn't be lower than number 1 on my list. So, but again, just due to the Sam Darnold and J.J. McCarthy factor, he's a little bit lower. But again, a lot of these guys are interchangeable. At number 3, Ja'Marr Chase, the wide receiver 11 last year, and now is without Joe Burrow for the majority of the season. But before Joe Burrow got hurt, Ja'Marr Chase had a 52-point game. But 2 years ago, when we go back to when these two were fully healthy for the entire season, Ja'Marr Chase was the wide receiver 5 on a per-game basis. Joe Burrow should be back to start the season. This O-line has only gotten better, and with the departure of Joe Mixon and all the rumblings around the future of T. Higgins, it seems as though Ja'Marr Chase is going to be the only reliable target in this offense from day 1 until the end of the season. Now, I will adjust these rankings if T. Higgins does officially get traded. Of course, that brings Ja'Marr Chase down a little bit, but we just need Joe Burrow and Ja'Marr Chase to stay healthy, and if they can, they're both top 3 at their respective positions. At number 2, we have the wide receiver 1 from last year. Takes a small step back here as my wide receiver 2, but CeeDee Lamb, he was the wide receiver 1 last year, and by a decent margin, by about 30 total fantasy points over Tyreek Hill, and he was averaging just about 24.5 fantasy points a game. On top of the fact that there's no true contender for targets in this offense, other than maybe Jake Ferguson, it's also a contract year for a guy like CeeDee Lamb. So as crazy as it might sound, CeeDee Lamb is walking into a situation where he might have an even better season than last year, where of course he was the runaway wide receiver one. Again, it's a huge year in Dallas. It's a huge prove-it year. And if anybody on this team wants that next big contract, they're going to have to show out this year. And if this team wants to compete, it starts with Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb. So, of course, I think CeeDee Lamb, prime position to be a safe floor and ceiling option yet again. And he should be, arguably, the top receiver off the board. But I'm not going to go there yet. I understand that the consensus wants to put CeeDee Lamb as the consensus wide receiver one. I'm not there yet. Again, I just reiterated. But Tyreek Hill at number one for me. He was the wide receiver two last season. But it's worth note that he didn't play a game and a half last season, and this offense kind of tailored off to mediocrity at the tail end of the season. So with all of that, he still finished as the wide receiver two. If they didn't, he would have been the clear runaway wide receiver one. But hear this fact out, because before the injury that Tyreek Hill had, he was on a historic fantasy football pace to start the season. He was averaging just about 26 to 26 and a half fantasy points a game in full PPR formats. And from weeks 1 to 13, of course, he was dominant for the majority of the season. Got a lot of us that number one seed in the fantasy playoffs. But something, averaging 26 fantasy points a game is something we haven't seen done since Cooper Kupp's Triple Crown year. Keep that in mind, right? This is a guy in Tyreek Hill and that, unlike all the other receivers on this list and unlike any other receivers in the league, this is a guy in Tyreek Hill that doesn't need 6, 7, 8 receptions to be dominant in fantasy football. He just needs two receptions on a weekly basis to win you your week, basically. Because this is a guy that could take 2 screen passes to the house, and he can have 2 receptions for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, and that's going to win you your week, or at least put you in a really good spot to get over the hump. Again, this is a guy that, he doesn't need the volume, but he's that electric, and he's still in the prime of his career, where one simple screen pass can be all it takes to take you all the way to the championship. But again, this is a guy in Tyreek Hill, the Cheetah, my number one wide receiver off the board in 2024. But I talked fast there, so if you enjoyed and you stuck throughout the video, drop a like, subscribe to the channel. Again, every single week we drop 2 fantasy football videos, whether if it's rankings, whether if it's do not draft videos, whether if it's mock drafts, whatever the case is. We do everything here on the channel. And if you have any questions for me from now until the end of the fantasy season, drop them in the comments. I get back to you guys as quickly as I possibly can, because at the end of the day, we're all fantasy football addicts, especially if you're here in the off season. But that's going to do it. Until tomorrow, where we have some NFC North predictions. Stay happy, stay healthy, get out of here.